January 17, 1940, the frozen plains outside Narvik, Norway, were quiet but tense. A pale sun struggled to rise over jagged fjords, casting long shadows across the snow-streaked landscape. Soldiers huddled behind battered walls of rock and ice, breath-forming clouds in the biting air. The distant rumble of engines whispered through the fjord, and then, unmistakably, a sound unlike anything they had trained for, a low, mechanical growl that grew louder with every second. On the ridge above, a German commander squinted through binoculars. His maps, carefully drawn and studied, offered no warning of what was approaching. Then the first shapes emerged, towering armored vehicles, their steel skins glinting in the weak sunlight, rolling relentlessly over rough terrain. Infantry tried to regroup, but hesitation spread like wildfire. Radios crackled with frantic commands, yet the enemy seemed unstoppable. In that instant, panic took hold. Veteran officers, accustomed to strategy and discipline, froze, eyes wide. They had faced artillery, machine guns, and aerial bombing, but nothing like this. And as the first shells tore through frozen ground, it became clear the battlefield had changed forever. This was just the beginning of a war where innovation would strike terror in the hearts of even the most seasoned commanders. By early 1940, Europe was already in the grip of a war that had shattered assumptions about modern combat. The German Wehrmacht had demonstrated an unprecedented capacity for speed and coordination during the invasion of Poland in September 1939. Blitzkrieg, a term barely understood outside military circles, was not merely a tactic. It was a philosophy that combined mechanized infantry, armored units, and close air support into a single, unstoppable force. Commanders across the continent watched with apprehension, yet few anticipated how far the Germans would push innovation. In the winter months, the war seemed almost static in the north. Norway and Denmark had been invaded, but German supply lines were stretched, and the Allies were still hesitant to commit fully to counteroffensives. The terrain favored defenders. Snow-laden forests, fjords, and frozen rivers made mobility difficult. Standard military doctrine assumed that heavy armor could not easily traverse such obstacles, and commanders relied on established fortifications to halt mechanized assaults. Maps were studied, plans drawn, and contingencies prepared, but they could not account for the rapid improvisation that would soon redefine the battlefield. Meanwhile, technological progress surged in secrecy. Germany had refined tank designs beyond the clunky models of the previous decade. Panzer divisions, equipped with lighter, faster tanks like the Panzer I and II, could exploit gaps in enemy lines, supported by artillery and dive bombers that struck with near-perfect coordination. Infantry units trained to follow tanks, carrying supplies and reinforcements, turned what was traditionally a slow advance into a rapid, mobile assault. Even the sound of these mechanized forces moving in unison became a weapon, sowing confusion and fear before a single shot was fired. On the other side, Allied commanders believed they were prepared. Norwegian coastal defenses, supplemented by British and French forces, had bunkers and artillery positioned to repel a conventional assault. Generals relied on rigid formations, fortified lines, and intelligence reports that underestimated German adaptability. Many assumed that the snow, ice, and rugged terrain would neutralize the advantage of mechanized forces. But these calculations failed to consider the psychological dimension of war, the fear induced by the unexpected, the terror triggered by something entirely new appearing on the battlefield. It was in this environment of calculated caution and growing tension that innovations designed to shock and overwhelm first emerged. German engineers experimented with flamethrower-equipped vehicles, specialized mountain artillery, and even nascent armored recovery vehicles capable of navigating ice and snow. Coordinated air attacks, supported by dive bombers like the Junkers Ru-87 Stuka, could destroy key positions within minutes, leaving defenders stunned and disoriented. Intelligence reports from the front often spoke of panic and disbelief among defending troops, phrases that would soon be echoed in the diaries and memoirs of Allied commanders. Commanders on both sides understood that war was evolving. The age of static defense, of carefully drawn lines on a map, was giving way to fluid, mobile warfare. Yet the full impact of this evolution was not yet grasped. Across the fjords of Norway, along the frozen forests of France and the Ardennes, Officers braced themselves for battles that would test not just strategy and courage, but nerves and intuition. The German military did not merely intend to win through force, it sought to dominate the minds of its opponents, to force hesitation and confusion through speed, coordination, and the sheer shock of innovation. By the time the first armored units reached critical positions and the first dive bombers screamed down from above, panic was already rippling through the ranks. Decisions made in those first moments would determine the fate of entire divisions. The battlefield, once a predictable arena of artillery duels and infantry charges, had become a theater of psychological warfare as much as physical confrontation. Commanders were no longer only directing soldiers, they were confronting fear itself. And this fear was about to be magnified. Innovations and tactics that would have seemed impossible a year earlier were now being deployed in full force, striking at the very heart of military confidence. As winter winds swept across snow-slicked ridges and icy fjords, commanders on both sides would soon learn a hard truth. When something new and terrifying appears on the battlefield, experience can become irrelevant, training insufficient, and panic the most powerful weapon of all. The stage was set. What followed would not merely be battles, it would be moments when the sight of a single machine, tactic, or unit could send seasoned commanders into chaos, changing the course of engagements before a single bullet was fired. The winter of 1940 marked a turning point in how battles were fought, and how commanders reacted to what they saw. Across Europe, innovations designed to shock the enemy were beginning to appear on the front lines. These were not mere incremental improvements. They were instruments crafted to exploit fear itself. Infantry units, no matter how disciplined, could be routed by machines and tactics that defied conventional expectations. One of the earliest examples came in Norway, where German mountain troops advanced with coordinated support from Stuka dive bombers. The shriek of their sirens, amplified by the icy cliffs, was not just a warning, it was a psychological weapon. Defenders reported that soldiers froze in place, hesitation spreading from squad to squad. Even experienced officers found themselves shouting orders that went unheard, trying to regain control as their lines unraveled. The combination of speed, noise, and sudden destruction undermined confidence before direct combat even began. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, new tank designs and armored vehicles began to redefine mobility. The Panzer III and IV, equipped with more powerful cannons, could breach fortifications that had previously seemed impenetrable. Against static defensive lines, these tanks were terrifyingly effective. Allied commanders accustomed to slow advances and predictable artillery exchanges now faced a foe that could strike unexpectedly, bypassing strong points and forcing rapid retreats. Reports from the field described officers staring in disbelief as entire defensive positions collapsed under coordinated mechanized assaults. Beyond armor and aircraft, engineers introduced weapons designed to disrupt morale as much as positions. The visual and sensory impact of these weapons created a profound psychological effect. Defenders did not simply fear injury, they feared annihilation. Commanders, trained to evaluate strategy and logistics, now had to contend with the elemental terror of fire, noise, and unstoppable momentum. Even conventional artillery began to play a role in the unexpected. High-velocity guns and improved targeting allowed German forces to strike with precision at points previously thought secure. Mines, wire traps, and newly developed mortar forced defenders into predictable movements, making them easier targets. Every innovation built upon the last, creating a cascading effect. Confusion led to hesitation, hesitation led to panic, and panic undermined even the most carefully crafted plans. In every theater, the message was clear. The battlefield had changed. The war was no longer a test of numbers or position alone. Commanders who relied solely on maps and doctrine found themselves reacting often too late to the unforeseen. Those who attempted to adapt quickly sometimes succeeded, but more often, they were caught in a spiral of indecision, watching as their formations crumbled. The ability to strike fear became as decisive as firepower itself. These developments were not limited to a single front or army. Across the Ardennes, in the deserts of North Africa, and in the snowbound forests of Finland, the same pattern repeated. Innovations in weapons and tactics caused momentary, but critical, breakdowns in command. Panic, once rare in professional armies, became a force that commanders had to anticipate and sometimes could not control. And yet, amid this chaos, military leadership continued to evolve. German doctrine emphasized initiative and improvisation, exploiting moments of enemy hesitation. Allied forces, initially confounded, began to recognize patterns. Certain weapons, units, or coordinated attacks consistently caused disorientation and fear. What was terrifying on sight could, if understood, be countered, but understanding required experience under fire, something many officers did not have the luxury to gain. By the spring of 1940, these innovations had transformed warfare into something both more dynamic and more psychologically treacherous. The enemy was no longer just a force to be engaged, it was a mind to be unsettled. And it was on this stage that the moments of true panic would emerge, where commanders confronted not only the skill and firepower of their opponent, but the raw, destabilizing effect of surprise and terror. This realization set the scene for the first examples that earned the reputation described in reports and diaries, the weapons, units, and battlefield maneuvers that caused enemy commanders to freeze, hesitate, and sometimes abandon positions entirely. It was here, in the intersection of technology, strategy, and human psychology, that the seeds of panic were sown and where the next sections of our story will explore the angles of its devastating impact. On the battlefield, fear is contagious. One soldier hesitates and the ripple spreads. One commander freezes and entire divisions falter. In Norway, during the German advance toward Narvik, first-hand accounts described defenders' eyes widening as armored vehicles and dive bombers appeared over the horizon. Infantrymen trained for months in winter conditions suddenly found themselves paralyzed, unable to process the chaos before them. Officers shouted orders, but sound seemed swallowed by the roar of engines, explosions, and the shriek of Stuka sirens. Panic did not arise solely from the threat of death, emerged from uncertainty, the inability to predict what would strike next. Experienced men, hardened by months of war, admitted in journals that they had never felt such unmoored terror. Fear in this sense became a weapon, shaping decisions and movements as powerfully as artillery. This psychological factor had cascading effects. Troops who might have held positions surrendered early, fled into unsafe terrain, or acted against orders. Commanders, witnessing hesitation, were forced into split-second decisions that often compounded chaos. Human reactions, shaped by instinct and adrenaline, became decisive elements of combat. In battles where innovation appeared suddenly, fear dictated outcomes long before bullets or shells landed. The tactical brilliance behind these innovations lay in their ability to exploit human vulnerability. German military planners recognized that mobility, coordination, and surprise could amplify fear into paralysis. Tanks did not simply punch holes in defenses. They bypassed strong points entirely, cutting off retreat routes and leaving commanders scrambling. In France, panzer divisions executed encirclements through the Ardennes that shocked Allied officers, who had assumed dense forests would be impenetrable. Dive bombers added another layer. The Stuka's dive, precise and terrifyingly loud, allowed rapid destruction of key positions. When German units struck in tandem with armored advances, defenders faced simultaneous threats from air and land. These combined arms tactics left little room for conventional countermeasures. Commanders confronted with such coordinated assaults often made decisions under extreme time pressure, leading to miscalculations that escalated panic. Even conventional artillery, when integrated into rapid assaults, became a force multiplier. High-velocity rounds targeted communication nodes and supply lines, creating confusion in units unprepared for speed as a weapon. The tactical genius was simple but effective. The faster the enemy's cohesion broke, the less resistance they could offer. Panic, in this sense, was a battlefield variable deliberately triggered by maneuver, speed, and timing. Technology transformed fear into a tangible, visible force. The machines that rolled across frozen fields or screeched through fjords were more than steel. They were instruments of psychological warfare. The Panzer III and IV, with their powerful cannons and armor, rendered many defensive positions irrelevant. Stuka dive bombers with precision bombs and sirens engineered to terrify did more than kill, they intimidated. Flamethrowers cleared bunkers while terrifying anyone who witnessed them. Even relatively minor technological innovations could have outsized effects. Smoke generators, mobile mortar, and armored reconnaissance vehicles allowed German units to operate unpredictably, leaving defenders guessing at every turn. Commanders were forced to account not just for firepower, but for what they could not see or anticipate. In multiple battlefronts from Norway to France, reports repeatedly mention officers staring in disbelief at the capabilities before them, a testimony to the power of technology to disrupt not just plans, but the minds directing them. The psychological weight of technology extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Tales of unstoppable tanks, screaming dive bombers, and armored flame units spread quickly among soldiers and officers. Rumors and fear magnified the real impact, ensuring that even units yet to encounter these innovations approached combat with trepidation. Technology in this sense was both physical and symbolic, a representation of a new kind of warfare that combined destructive power with shock and awe. These three angles, human, tactical, and technological, intersected to create moments of true panic on the battlefield. Soldiers and commanders alike faced forces they could neither fully predict nor counter with conventional training. The stage was set for leadership decisions, enemy reactions, and moral dilemmas that would amplify the chaos. Commanders faced unprecedented stress when confronted with sudden, terrifying innovations on the battlefield. Even experienced officers, trained to assess, plan, and execute under pressure, were forced into split-second decisions that could determine the survival of thousands. During the German assault on France in May 1940, Allied generals encountered the full shock of blitzkrieg. Panzer divisions penetrated through the Ardennes, a region thought impassable for heavy armor. Reports from the front described commanders staring at maps as if they had changed overnight, while subordinate units scrambled for guidance. Panic among leadership was not merely hesitation, it was sometimes catastrophic misjudgment. Orders were delayed, contradictory, or ignored as officers grappled with scenarios they had never trained for. The German approach deliberately exploited this. Rapid advances and combined arms tactics ensured that commanders were constantly reacting, never initiating. In Norway, the sight of armored vehicles cresting ridges prompted senior officers to retreat from observation posts, leaving units without coordination. Leadership faltering at the top echoed down through the ranks, amplifying confusion and panic. The reaction of opposing forces was often immediate and revealing. Soldiers and commanders on the receiving end of these innovations were not merely surprised, they were unsettled in ways that reduced combat effectiveness. In Narvik, Norwegian and Allied units faced mechanized assaults coupled with Stuka bombing runs. Infantry units, accustomed to holding fortified positions, found themselves disoriented and vulnerable. Retreats occurred not only to avoid casualties, but because units could no longer trust their own command structure under pressure. Enemy panic could ripple unpredictably. A single armored breakthrough or aerial strike often prompted entire units to disengage, creating gaps that further amplified chaos. In the Battle of France, German forces exploited these reactions, encircling forces that had lost cohesion due to fear and indecision. Commanders noted in their diaries that enemy troops sometimes abandoned positions without engaging, underscoring that psychological shock could be as decisive as firepower. Fear, once triggered, became contagious across the battlefield. The use of terror as a tool raised difficult ethical questions both during and after combat. Weapons and tactics designed to instill panic, flamethrowers, screaming dive bombers, shock tactics blurred the line between legitimate military strategy and psychological assault. For many commanders, witnessing their own troops succumb to fear was a harrowing experience, testing not just leadership skills but moral resolve. Could fear be considered a legitimate tool of war, or did it cross a threshold into cruelty? Reports from the front reveal that even German officers recognized the moral weight of their innovations. Some accounts describe hesitation when flame units were deployed near civilian areas, while others praised the efficiency of shock tactics without acknowledging the human suffering they caused. On the receiving end, commanders struggled with similar dilemmas: how to maintain order among troops who were terrified, demoralized, or disoriented by the sheer scale of what confronted them. Panic was not merely strategic. It was deeply human, forcing leaders to confront the psychological and ethical consequences of modern warfare. When examined together, these angles leadership, enemy response, and morality demonstrate that panic was more than an incidental effect. It shaped decisions, dictated outcomes, and forced both sides to confront the limitations of conventional command and control. Technology, tactics, and human instinct collided, producing moments when the battlefield itself seemed to defy expectation, and commanders faced choices that could determine life and death for thousands. May 10, 1940, the forests and rivers of the Ardennes lay quiet, deceptive under the spring sun. French commanders believed their defenses were secure. Tank brigades and infantry divisions were deployed in traditional formations, confident that the dense woods would prevent a major armored advance. Yet, at precisely 4:30, the German offensive began. Engines roared, and the 1st Panzer divisions emerged from the shadows of the trees, their tracks crushing undergrowth and tearing through assumptions of impassable terrain. The French 7th Army had not anticipated this. Officers at headquarters watched through maps and binoculars, as columns of tanks and mechanized infantry appeared where none were expected. Orders were issued frantically, positions were reinforced, artillery redeployed, but confusion spread faster than movement. Units misread signals, retreated prematurely, and in some cases abandoned fortified positions entirely. Panic was no longer confined to the frontline soldiers. It infected the command posts themselves. Commanders, trained to maintain composure under fire, found themselves reacting to sights that seemed impossible. Simultaneously, Stuka dive bombers struck the rear lines, their sirens engineered to terrify scream through the sky as bombs exploded on supply depots, bridges, and command centers. French soldiers reported that the noise, coupled with the sight of advancing tanks, created a sense of inevitability. "We were already defeated before we even fired a shot," wrote one lieutenant in his diary. Communications broke down. Radio operators, overwhelmed by simultaneous requests and reports, could not coordinate defense effectively. The German assault exploited the psychological effect of surprise as much as its physical impact, turning fear into a force multiplier. Further north in Norway, a similar story unfolded. German mountain troops, supported by mechanized infantry and armored vehicles, advanced along frozen fjords toward Narvik. Norwegian and Allied forces had fortified positions along ridges, expecting to delay the attackers. Yet when the first armored vehicles crested the slopes, accompanied by dive bombers targeting defensive bunkers, panic spread rapidly. Soldiers hesitated to fire, unsure of how to respond. Officers attempted to rally their men, but the roar of engines and the screech of bombs drowned out commands. In these crucial moments, the psychological weight of innovation was palpable. The battlefield was no longer a contest of firepower alone, it was a contest of nerve and perception. The interplay of speed, coordination, and shock became decisive. In France, the German 7th Panzer Division under General Erwin Rommel pushed through Sedan, crossing the Meuse River with unexpected efficiency. Bridges were captured before demolition could occur, and French units retreated chaotically, creating gaps for subsequent armored advances. Reports from French commanders describe a surreal sense of disbelief. They were trained to expect tanks, to plan for artillery barrages, yet they had never faced an assault that combined rapid armored breakthroughs with precise aerial strikes in perfect synchronization. Panic dictated movement, retreat dictated strategy, and the Germans capitalized on every hesitation. Even small encounters became decisive. In one forested sector, a single German tank platoon rolled into a clearing previously held by French infantry. The sight of steel and gunfire caused the defenders to abandon their trenches, leaving an unguarded path for additional German forces. Commanders tried to issue counter orders, but by the time messages reached front lines, the opportunity for effective resistance had vanished. Each moment of fear magnified the next, creating a chain reaction that could not be easily contained. Across both Norway and France, the same pattern emerged. Experienced officers confronted innovations that defied expectation. Tanks that moved where none should have been, dive bombers that struck with terrifying precision, flamethrower units that annihilated defensive positions, all combined to produce a single outcome: panic. These moments were not minor skirmishes. They were turning points that reshaped entire campaigns. By late morning, the battlefield itself seemed to dictate the terms of engagement. Retreats, miscommunications, and indecision created opportunities the Germans exploited ruthlessly. Commanders who tried to regain control often found their efforts too late, their units already in disarray. The tactical advantage of innovation had become strategic dominance through fear. And yet, even amid chaos, some units held, resisting panic and providing critical resistance moments of courage that would define human responses under extreme stress. In these decisive hours, the battlefield demonstrated a stark truth. When technology, speed, and psychological shock converge, panic is as lethal as any weapon. Commanders who underestimated it paid the price in lost territory, shattered units, and a collapse of defensive cohesion. The first wave of these engagements revealed the full power of innovations that were designed not merely to kill, but to terrify, destabilize, and force decisions under impossible pressure. And as the sun rose higher over Europe's forests, rivers, and fjords, it illuminated a new reality. The war had evolved. The decisive moment was no longer simply a matter of firepower. It was a question of nerve, perception, and the ability to adapt instantly to threats that could paralyze the mind even before striking the body. This naturally leads into Climax Turning Point Section 2, where we continue with the aftermath of these panic-driven breakthroughs, the spread of chaos, and how they ultimately decided the battle's. By midday, the initial shockwaves had rippled through entire divisions. In France, retreating units from Sedan converged chaotically on roads designed for orderly withdrawal. Convoys jammed with trucks, artillery, and infantry created bottlenecks, leaving commanders unable to redeploy or reinforce positions. German forces pressed forward, exploiting every hesitation. Tanks that had broken through the Ardennes now threatened to encircle entire corps. Panic, once sparked, became a self-perpetuating force. Indecision created vulnerability, vulnerability invited attack, and attack intensified fear. Air support magnified the effect. Stuka dive bombers swooped in over retreating columns, their sirens screaming, their bombs precise. Even seasoned French officers admitted later that the noise and destruction froze men in place, making coordination almost impossible. In some sectors, entire battalions surrendered without firing a shot, overwhelmed by the psychological impact of what seemed an unstoppable advance. Commanders attempted counterattacks, but the timing was off, units were scattered, and momentum was irreversibly lost. Meanwhile, in Norway, Narvik's defenders faced a parallel crisis. German mechanized units exploited narrow passes and frozen fjord edges, forcing Norwegian and Allied forces into defensive pockets. Soldiers reported that panic spread faster than the attackers themselves. Men abandoned positions, officers shouted futile commands, and retreating columns collided in icy chaos. Here, too, innovation dictated the outcome. The combination of armor, mobility, and air power created situations where human reaction could no longer match the speed of the assault. Small engagements became decisive. In one valley near Sedan, a single platoon of Panzer IAs rolled into a crossroads, cutting off multiple retreating units. French commanders, uncertain of the size of the force, hesitated. By the time reconnaissance confirmed the threat, the enemy had advanced beyond the intersection, severing supply lines and communication channels. Panic compounded as radio messages conflicted, orders were misunderstood, and the defenders' ability to regroup vanished. This microcosm reflected the macrocosm. The battlefield had become a theater of fear as much as firepower. Leadership decisions, or the lack thereof, magnified these effects. French and Norwegian officers were forced to adapt under unprecedented pressure, often improvising in real time. Some succeeded, organizing pockets of resistance or delaying enemy advances just long enough to save units from annihilation. Others faltered entirely, their hesitation mirrored by the men under their command. In both theaters, the visible presence of new weapons and tactics forced commanders to confront fear as a tangible factor and enemy in its own right. By late afternoon in France, the German breakthrough was irreversible. Entire armies were in retreat, roads clogged with men, vehicles, and artillery. Panic had turned defensive strategies into routes, and the battlefield had been transformed in a matter of hours. Reports from surviving officers noted a surreal sequence of disbelief, fear, and exhaustion. Units that had trained, drilled, and planned meticulously were undone not by overwhelming firepower alone, but by the combination of speed, shock, and psychological pressure. In Norway, Narvik fell under similar circumstances. Coastal artillery had fired valiantly, and infantry units resisted fiercely, but the coordinated German advance, reinforced by armored vehicles and dive bombers, overwhelmed defensive positions. Commanders acknowledged later that panic among troops and their own moments of hesitation had significantly hastened the collapse. The psychological impact of innovation on the battlefield had decisively shaped the engagement. These climactic moments highlight a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Victory is rarely determined by firepower alone. Speed, coordination, surprise, and the calculated use of fear can transform even the most disciplined forces into fragmented units. In both France and Norway, the sight of a single innovation, be it a tank, a coordinated assault, or a screaming dive bomber, was sufficient to disrupt entire command structures. Panic became the instrument through which strategic objectives were achieved, magnifying the effectiveness of every maneuver, weapon, and tactic. As the sun set over the ravaged forests of France and the icy fjords of Norway, commanders surveyed the aftermath of these engagements. Their maps, once tools of certainty, now bore witness to chaos. The innovations that had sparked panic had done more than inflict casualties. They had broken cohesion, undermined confidence, and rewritten the rules of engagement. In the hours that followed, survivors would attempt to regroup, but the lessons of fear were indelibly etched into the minds of officers and soldiers alike. And with the battlefield transformed, the consequences extended beyond the immediate fight. Retreats, losses, and shattered morale would influence strategy, doctrine, and decisions in campaigns yet to come. What had begun as innovation and surprise had matured into something more powerful, a demonstration of how panic, skillfully induced, could become a decisive weapon. The battlefield, once alive with coordinated defense, had been transformed into a landscape of shattered formations, abandoned equipment, and stunned soldiers. In France, the German advance through Sedan and the Ardennes left entire French divisions in disarray. Roads were clogged with retreating troops, artillery pieces abandoned, and supply convoys immobilized by panic-induced congestion. Commanders struggled to re-establish lines, but the momentum had already shifted irreversibly. The rapid collapse of defensive positions sent shockwaves through the higher echelons of the French army, forcing generals to reconsider strategies that had once seemed secure. Casualties were significant, but the most immediate cost was organizational. Units that had trained meticulously over months or years were now scattered, their cohesion broken. Reports from surviving officers described troops frozen in fear, unable to respond to orders or coordinate counterattacks. In several instances, entire battalions surrendered after encountering a single German armored platoon, the sight of mechanized force enough to convince soldiers that resistance was futile. The psychological impact extended beyond those directly engaged. Neighboring units, hearing of retreats and panicked withdrawal, often mirrored the same behavior even before facing the enemy themselves. Norway experienced similar consequences. At Narvik, German mountain troops, armored vehicles, and Stuka bombers had shattered defensive positions. Norwegian and Allied forces fought valiantly, but fear and confusion magnified the effects of losses. Officers reported that the combination of surprise, overwhelming mechanized force, and precise aerial attacks led to indecision at multiple command levels. Soldiers hesitated to fire, retreated prematurely, or abandoned positions entirely. In some cases, defensive positions that could have held were surrendered due to the panic sweeping through the ranks, a stark demonstration of the intangible power of terror on the battlefield. The collapse of cohesion had strategic consequences beyond the immediate battlefield. In France, the German breakthrough through the Ardennes allowed armored divisions to encircle large portions of the French army, cutting off retreat routes and accelerating the fall of northern sectors. Commanders who had relied on static lines and methodical deployments found themselves reacting to the enemy rather than dictating the tempo. In Norway, the loss of key positions along fjords and ridges opened pathways for German consolidation of territory, making counteroffensives more difficult and forcing Allied forces to rely on reinforcement and naval evacuation under increasingly constrained conditions. Reports, diaries, and official records emphasized that panic, more than casualties, had become a decisive factor. French General Alphonse Joseph Georges noted that our formations were intact, yet paralyzed, as if the sight of the enemy's armor had frozen our will to act. Norwegian officers echoed similar sentiments, describing how the advance of armored vehicles struck terror that could not be reasoned away. Across both theaters, panic reshaped tactical and operational decisions, dictating retreat and surrender far more effectively than direct firepower in many cases. The human dimension was stark. Soldiers who had survived months of cold, fatigue, and artillery were undone by what they perceived as an unstoppable force. The psychological toll on officers was severe. Leaders who had prided themselves on composure and decisiveness found that conventional experience offered little guidance in the face of innovations that combined speed, firepower, and shock. Morale plummeted, not because of numbers or material losses alone, but because the battlefield had become unpredictable, threatening to overwhelm human judgment itself. This immediate aftermath highlighted a profound lesson for military planners. Tactical and technological superiority could not be measured solely in guns and armor. The capacity to induce fear, hesitation, and panic could be equally decisive. The German approach demonstrated this principle with ruthless efficiency. By exploiting both innovation and psychology, they achieved objectives while minimizing the time and resources typically required for conventional assaults. As night fell over the Ardennes and the fjords of Norway, commanders surveyed the wreckage of coordination, trust, and morale. The survivors would attempt to regroup, repair communication lines, and restore cohesion. But the experience had irrevocably altered their understanding of warfare. Fear, once incidental, had proven itself a weapon capable of shaping the battlefield before bullets or bombs had even landed. And as commanders confronted the scale of disruption, they were forced to ask, how could armies prepare for a foe that wielded not only firepower, but terror? The answer would shape decisions, reinforcements, and strategies in the battles yet to come, setting the stage for prolonged campaigns where the psychological dimension of combat would be as critical as any physical engagement. The immediate chaos on the battlefield was only the beginning. In the weeks and months following the Ardennes breakthrough and the Norwegian engagements, commanders and strategists across Europe grappled with the implications of panic as a decisive factor in warfare. In France, the rapid collapse of northern defenses forced the government and military leadership to accelerate retreats, reorganize entire armies, and reconsider doctrines that had relied on static fortifications and linear defense. The psychological impact lingered far beyond the battlefield, shaping decisions at headquarters in Paris and London. The strategic consequences were profound. German armored divisions, having exploited fear-induced disorder, were able to penetrate deep into French territory with minimal resistance, encircling units and capturing vast numbers of soldiers. Military analysts later observed that the psychological impact of blitzkrieg often produced results equivalent to numerical superiority. Units that might have held their positions in conventional engagements faltered because the fear triggered by speed, coordination, and innovation disrupted decision-making at every level. Commanders recognized that the ability to induce panic was as critical as artillery, tanks, or infantry strength. In Norway, the psychological effect of the German advance altered not only the outcome of the battles, but the planning of subsequent Allied operations. The rapid seizure of Narvik and surrounding fjords forced the Allies to consider evacuation over reinforcement in some sectors. The fear experienced by Norwegian and British officers demonstrated that even well-trained units could be undone by the unexpected deployment of combined arms in difficult terrain. This realization influenced operational planning in other theaters, emphasizing reconnaissance, anticipation of innovation, and the need for flexible, rapid response strategies. The long-term impact extended to doctrine and training. Armies began to incorporate psychological resilience into officer education, studying the ways fear could disrupt cohesion and impede command. Simulated battlefield scenarios emphasized rapid adaptation to unexpected threats, with exercises designed to prevent panic from cascading through units. German success in exploiting fear prompted Allied forces to develop countermeasures. better communication networks, mobile reserves, and coordination between infantry, armor, and air support to regain initiative when confronted with novel threats. Moreover, the use of fear as a tool had broader ethical and moral consequences. Commanders had to confront the psychological toll of deliberately inducing terror, both on enemy soldiers and inadvertently on their own troops. Observers noted that troops exposed to panic-inducing innovations often experienced heightened stress, exhaustion, and trauma, sometimes affecting performance long after engagements ended. In Norway, French and British soldiers recalled sleepless nights and persistent anxiety after encounters with armored vehicles and dive bombers, demonstrating that the battlefield's psychological scars could outlast the physical damage. The ripple effects also shaped intelligence and reconnaissance. Commanders realized that knowledge of enemy capabilities alone was insufficient. Understanding how innovations might disrupt morale and decision-making was equally vital. Reports emphasizing the panic caused by mechanized assaults and aerial bombardment became essential reading in war colleges and strategy sessions. Lessons from Narvik and the Ardennes informed preparations for future campaigns, including defensive planning against Germany's continued use of speed, coordination, and psychological shock. By the summer of 1940, the war had evolved in fundamental ways. Panic, once an incidental or rare occurrence, had emerged as a decisive element in operational planning and battlefield outcomes. Commanders who understood its dynamics could mitigate its effects. Those who underestimated it risked catastrophic losses. The events in France and Norway revealed that innovation in warfare extended beyond weapons or tactics, encompassed the manipulation of perception, the orchestration of fear, and the deliberate creation of chaos to achieve strategic objectives. As armies adapted, the lessons of these battles endured. Officers studied the collapse of cohesion under pressure, soldiers trained to maintain discipline amidst overwhelming shock, and military planners designed operations that considered not only firepower and positioning, but human psychology itself. The consequences of panic on the battlefield became a benchmark for evaluating both enemy and allied performance, shaping the trajectory of the war and the evolution of modern warfare for decades to come. In the end, the battles of France and Norway reveal more than just tactics and weapons. They reveal the human heart of warfare. Panic is intangible, yet its power is undeniable. A single armored unit, a coordinated assault, or the scream of dive bombers can unravel the most disciplined formations, not through sheer firepower alone, but by striking at the nerves of those who command and those who fight. The war was no longer merely a contest of strength or numbers. It had become a contest of perception, courage, and adaptability. Commanders who confronted these innovations learned that preparation and training, while vital, could be undone by fear. The Ardennes and Narvik demonstrated that the mind could be as vulnerable as the body, that hesitation, indecision, and disbelief could determine the fate of armies. Human psychology became as much a battlefield as the forests, rivers, and fjords themselves. Soldiers and officers alike were tested not only by enemy fire, but by the terror of the unexpected, and in these moments, history was forged in the crucible of fear. Yet from this crucible also came lessons. Armies adapted. Strategies evolved. Doctrine began to account for not only weaponry and terrain, but the capacity to endure, to act decisively under pressure, and to anticipate the unforeseen. Fear, once a destructive force, became a study, something to understand, counter, and at times, wield. The innovations that sparked panic reshaped the conduct of war, accelerating the mechanization, coordination, and psychological sophistication that would define modern battlefields. Ultimately, these moments remind us of the profound interplay between human courage and human vulnerability. Technology, strategy, and leadership matter, but so does the mind that directs them. When fear is weaponized, it can eclipse bullets and shells, creating turning points that echo far beyond the immediate engagement. The battlefield teaches that while armies may clash in steel and fire, it is the resilience of human nerve that often determines who stands, who falls, and how history remembers them. In the quiet after the storm, when maps are marked, reports filed, and survivors counted, the legacy of panic endures not as spectacle, but as a lesson in the fragility and strength of those who face the unimaginable.